The first female scientist who inspired me when I was a young scientist was Dorothy Hodgkin. I went to a lecture that she gave for sixth formers at the University of Bristol, and she told a wonderful story about the solving of the structure of insulin that took her 35 years to achieve. And the thing that I learned from her was doggedness. You really have to be very dogged and persistent, and eventually you will achieve your goal.
There are a number of women who've been important in my scientific career, but I think the person who's most influential is Nancy Kleckner, who taught a molecular genetics course at Harvard when I was just converting from being a mathematician to a scientist. And overall, it's the best course I think I've ever taken, and had a significant effect on the way I think about science, and in particular about genetics. And it took me some time, but eventually I became a practicing geneticist, which I put down to some measure to that course.
The female scientist who's inspired me most is, without a doubt, my mother, Sophia Jordan. And she doesn't inspire me by being a celebrity scientist or any of that. She doesn't have a Nobel Prize, and she's not head of a university or anything like that. What I find so inspiring is that she overcomes the same challenges we all face in science. She had a 10-year career break, and she raised 3 teenage daughters all on her own. And that's the sort of thing that we come across, and it's choosing science despite those burdens that I find so inspirational.
The second person who inspired me very much as a young scientist was Anne McLaren. And what she taught me about leadership was that you don't have to be big or loud or shout at people in order to be a leader. As long as you're confident and very certain about what you're saying, then people will listen and they will follow you.
I think a good leader in science has to be somebody who's inspired by science themselves and can convey that, can inspire others, so that they can bring other people with them, essentially.
So in my opinion, a good leader has to have many talents. Obviously in science we want the big names, the big papers, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. I think there's leaders who are relatable to their sort of team, and that's very important, someone you know has gone through the same struggles. I think there's also a lot to be said for working with the scientific community, being visible at conferences, things like that, women in science, all that kind of campaigning I think is very important as well.
So the advice I'd give to young research scientists, there are really 2 things. The first is to pick problems that are important to work on, where there really is something that isn't yet known and where the knowledge will have a transforming effect, rather than things that you can do. It's much more important to do something that's going to have an impact than to do something that you know how to do already. And the second piece of advice is to always work with the very best, strongest and most interesting people that you can.
My advice to junior researchers is simply the advice my supervisor gave to me, which is say yes to absolutely everything. Say yes to giving speeches about women in science, and say yes to difficult and challenging projects. Even if they seem insurmountable, just say yes and try them. Be challenged, learn all the opportunities your PhD can give you, and just explore.
So my advice to a junior scientist just starting out in a research career is only choose to go into a research career if you're absolutely passionate about the subject and about doing research, and if you're passionate about wanting to find out the truth underneath that subject. Because if you're not passionate about it, the hours, the effort, the energy you have to put into it at all hours of the day and night will just be too much of a struggle unless you have that passion to keep you going.